Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well today. I've got a sore throat at the minute, so I'm doing a confirmation today. I wanted to say that with me, I always have to remember that I come from a dark place mentally and I never ever want to go back there again. So every day I do the best I can to live as healthy as I can, eating really clean and exercising as often as I can, because that's the biggest thing for me that helps keep my demons away really. And I just always focus on that because I started exercising again regularly again, and honestly the difference it's made in me is night and day. And I don't think enough people give it a try to help with depression or social anxiety or any other problems like that. So make sure you give it a go, and remember it's a process as well, and you're always going to have your mental health condition. I'm not sure if it can ever entirely go away, but it'll get 90% better, for me at the minute. But just remember that because it's something that you've always got to work on keeping it away, even if you don't feel like it. Because for me, I can get really far down and not really realize it because every day it's normal and it's just what's happening. And for me, I've only learned this from other people over time, but I'm an expert at hiding my emotions and how I'm feeling. So just make sure you watch out for yourself really, because at the end of the day, it's the most important person to take care of, because if you want to take care of anyone else also, you have to be alright within yourself too. So remember, you're not in this alone, we're a team and we'll get through this together. I love you and enjoy this video. Make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniak too, and the podcast in the description below. Okay. So my first story is actually my friend's story. So during these times, things took place when we were all in high school. I already knew about Skinwalkers and the like, but when these things happened to me, I wasn't sure if it really was a Skinwalker at the time or something else. I've noticed that most of the people who tell me they've experienced the same phenomenon live in the same area that I do, and my friend is no exception. Let's call him Jay. Jay lives maybe 5 minutes away from me. She told me that in her bus, there's this one area that they drive by to drop this kid off. She said she doesn't know why, but it always gives her the creeps. She told me that one early morning, when they were driving in that area to pick him up, all the kids in the bus saw this deer running alongside the bus. Not away from it, but besides it. She said it looked weird as hell. You know, the usual stuff about appearing humanoid. And it didn't look right. Like its limbs were awkwardly bent in a way that didn't seem human. And its eyes were freaky. This is my friend who doesn't know anything about Skinwalkers or anything of that mumbo jumbo. So I basically get chills. I tried being reasonable though, because maybe she just saw a regular deer, and since it was dark out, she just got confused, because it's Florida. We're not supposed to get that kind of thing down here. However, Jay swore up and down that it was not a normal deer. She said they all saw it and the bus driver slowed down to get a better look because everyone was weirded out by it, and it was basically something they've never seen before. After a while it ran off to disappear. Jay could have made this up, but like I said, why would she, and she's never seen anything like it. So anyway, I get freaked out because here I am knowing about this freaking Skinwalker, and my friend is literally clueless, thinking it's just a regular weird animal and she's just had a weird experience. Oh god. I ask her, do you even know what Skinwalkers are? She just looked at me and said, what's that? I googled it and showed her the deceptions of Skinwalkers, and she said, that's what I saw, but it had the head of a deer. She kept on saying it didn't look human or like an animal. After a while too, the kid from that bus stop didn't come back. Although that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with this, I just thought it was weird. So we were freaking out together, because what she said reminded me about what I heard at night, about it not being animal or human. See, a couple of years back, before she told me the story, I found myself one night sitting in my backyard like really early, maybe 3 in the morning or so, because I was thinking about things due to personal reasons. And I'm kind of just chilling and enjoying the silence when all of a sudden I hear this really freaky echoing scream from far away. The only way I can describe it as though that a woman and a cat were trapped together inside of a bag, screaming like they're getting murdered. I know mountain lions, foxes and owls are a thing, and they make the weirdest calls, but I looked up that stuff and it's just not the same. Like, usually you wouldn't be able to tell if it's an animal, right? It's just common sense, like my friend said. But that don't sound like animal or human. It sounded really unnatural and weird. Now, me being me, I was really upset at first. Now, the thing was really far away, and I actually thought that they might even be killing someone in the streets at 3 AM. That thing travelled so fast though. It sounded freaky as hell, and it was getting closer as it got to the more weird and unnatural sound. It only took me a couple of seconds to realise that this isn't a woman and this ain't a cat. Because while this was going down, I was going through it in my head like, what the hell is that thing? The first thing went from sounding like a good couple of miles away to being in my goddamn neighbourhood in 5 seconds. It was so weird because 1 second it sounded far away and the next it's on my street. I had a heart attack. The second I stood up, the scream just stopped, just like it started. And I'm really thinking at this point that it must be in front of my house. I walk as calmly as possible back inside, locking the doors. And the scream was back again, far away. I also heard some scraping and tapping sounds on my windows, but it happens at the same time now. I'd say 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning, and seen some black figures that aren't really affected by light outside of my house. To add detail to those things so you can get a feel for it, basically what happened is that I was doing a project for class, and since I procrastinate like I'm a pro up until 2 AM, I go to wash my hands from all the graphite, and the water's running while I hear a scraping sound against one of the bedroom doors that leads to my backyard. Now, most of the door is made up of these glass panes, the kind that make everything appear distorted and like blobby ash lumps. But then I see something pointy, dark against the window, almost looking ghost-like. I turn off the water and wait a bit, and it comes back and scrapes against the window again. I'm not trying to freak out, but my hands are shaking. It's stupid, but I actually whisper, "What are you doing?" while my voice trembled, and it stopped. I stop, and I don't hear anything except for what sounded like somebody walking by the window to the house every now and then. It continued that way for some nights too. Off and on, I would be hearing footsteps by my window, and even a tap on the window. Sometimes I ignored them, and other times I look out to see who's there, but I never see anyone. Another night I'd been outside in my backyard again, after having a rough day. It was maybe 3 or so AM in the morning. I'm sitting outside on the trampoline relaxing. I suddenly notice it's quiet, like kind of an uneasy silence that feels like a vacuum. I get this feeling of dread like I'm being watched, and I snap my head to the left and catch a glimpse of a humanoid dark figure under the side of my fence immediately. I'm a little freaked out because I notice that this thing is pure black. The streetlight hits it, but didn't do anything at all. It almost looked cartoony, if that makes any sense, because it's like the laws of physics don't apply to this thing. See, the reason I'm ranting about this is that I told both my friends my own story in psychology class at the same time. A lot of kids there live around my area. I mean like 5 to 15 max away. And they all start screaming, and the entire class went crazy when I finished because apparently they've all experienced the exact same thing as me. One girl told me about also hearing the tapping on her window at night. Another one told me about a really dark figure that seemed to follow her at night time, also screaming from the woods. Pretty much everyone's heard the screaming. It sounded the same, but that's the thing. In completely different time frames. That's the weird part because everyone's voice sounds different. So how could she describe the same thing I did? You know, like, if people were really killing each other out there, none of us thought it was an animal either. We all agreed from that point our town is pretty haunted, but I don't know. I mean, if there's any animal that sounded like that, I want to know, because that didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. I want to be enlightened, I want it to be something normal, but I just don't think it can be. The only person I heard of who's seen anything remotely specific is my friend's best friend from art school who went on the bus, and apparently, like, it's really bad to talk about skinwalkers, and even worse, if you see them, it's like bad mojo. These things are said to be able to travel very quickly, so thinking about that made it seem like we experienced a skinwalker. Okay, so I had this saved in my notes for a while, but today I just asked my co-worker, who was also my friend in high school who lives nearby. He got all spooked and said that he's heard and seen the same things, but he's very spiritual and often has visions. He told me that he believes they're doing dark magic in the woods because of a dream he had about some hooded up group sacrificing a woman and a cat. Which is freaky because it also turns out that behind our local dog park, there's a patch of woods with dodgy stuff going down there. I was shown this by an acquaintance during my freshman year who lives a couple of streets away. Down the path in the woods, after some time of walking, there's this huge cross smack bang in the middle of nowhere. It's basically raw. Some crooked old nails struck together with a rope hanging from where you'd put your hands to be crucified. It's huge too, and whenever I decide to check it out, I have this horrible feeling like I don't want to be there or something bad's gonna happen. Anyway, he says I'm not the first person that he knows has told him about experiencing these things. He's also had his experience while there with humanoid figures. He says that he saw one turn around and look at him, directly in the eyes as though it was trying to intimidate him before vanishing. So we basically don't mess with anything in the woods near me. My father died about 5 years ago, unexpectedly from a heart attack. To say it was hard on my mother would be an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel the same anymore, and about a year later, my mum and I made plans to take ourselves and an elderly dog, Ace, to move further south to a small town situated about half an hour from Atlanta, just a few days before we slated to move. I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever come to experience. All that was within my dream was my bedroom, a picture-perfect recreation of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if it was a sleep paralysis. To further add to the dream's realism, in the middle of the night, the street lights come on across the street that illuminate my window, creating a reflection on the wall perpendicular. In my dream, as I lay there, staring at the exact reflection on the wall, I saw an orb of smoke fade in from the shadows. Goosebumps chill across my skin as I lay there panicked, afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly it stopped moving and steadily hung in the light's reflection as though staring at me. Without a warning, it spoke to me in my dad's voice. "I'm sending something to watch you." Despite hearing my father's voice from the orb, I'm terrified, and I don't know why. "What?" I whisper. The orb remains silent, leaving an eerily dead silence in the voice. "Damn, black." I woke up almost instantaneously. I'm gasping for breath now. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, especially the final words. I chalked it up to my dad wishing well on us maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling. With the next couple of weeks, my mum and I moved out of Knoxville and headed down to South Georgia. She had managed to find a quaint little house for us. It had only 1 or 2 neighbours down there, and it's down the middle of a long gravel road in the middle of the woods. Nice for us. Probably the best reliever of all my stresses came with the move, however, was our neighbour's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as though she's my own. I left out a can of food once or twice a week for her. Even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she'd run up to me, helping ease my tensions. Less than a month into our new house, I suddenly awoken to a faint coughing that sounded like it is coming from downstairs. The important thing to know about our dog is that he has a collapsed trachea. He needs medicine to calm the condition down. So I'm used to walking up in the middle of the night to get his medicine. I proceed downstairs from my bedroom to give him his cough medicine, but I couldn't find him anywhere through the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping, and he wasn't in the kitchen. I mean, literally nowhere to be found. I didn't check my mum's room, however, as I didn't want to wake her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he had been in there anyway, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the coughing again, but it was coming from further away. It's outside now. I look over to the side door patio leading to the woodlands, and realised I'd forgotten to shut it. There it stood, slightly ajar. He got out. I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling out for my dog. "Ace! Ace!" I shouted out into the neighbouring woods. I heard another cough and shined my light in its direction. That time, it had echoed from down the gravel road. I swear, a path had never looked so terrifyingly desolate before in my life. I stared down that long gravel road that led us to our new home, but in that moment, I thought my dog was lost, and chalk it up to the new house jitters. I go, "Ace, come on," pressing on. But then I heard it, the cough I'd been following, almost right beside me, but this time, It didn't stay a dry cough like it had been before. Instead, it slowly descended into a low growl. I shined my light towards the sound. There stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. For a moment, I figure it's the fox that I'd mistaken for my dog. The whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing, it stared directly at me, its eyes glowing. However, our stare was broke when it tilted its head to the right, looking down, and there was our neighbour's little black cat staring beside me. However, it had completely changed its persona, no longer happy, affectionate, not the cat I knew. Instead, it arched its back upright, every fibre of her hair standing uneasily, uttering the lowest growl I've ever heard from a feline. In that moment, I figured she's just scared of the fox, so I knelt down beside her in a bid to coax her away and avoid fox hunting her. But no matter how many times I tried to coax her out of fight mode, she wouldn't. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more, but there wasn't a fox anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot of the gravel road, was a walking, rotten corpse of a coyote roadkill, slowly moving towards me. It took a step back. I'm absolutely mortified of what I'm seeing. Its jaws hanging loose, eyes are blood-stained, wobbling now. I've rubbed my eyes in disbelief, hoping I'm imagining it. But it was there, and it was real. And despite what was in front of us, the black cat just kept on growling at me. Suddenly, it stopped. The creature had ceased its walk towards me. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me, I now realise. That's when I mistakenly heard this beast mutter two words almost. Damn black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it's completely vanished. Even the brush it came from looked untouched. That's when the cat standing behind me calmed herself down. Almost as though nothing happened, she rubbed herself against my leg, returning to normal, now in a very loving state and manner. Despite technically not being mine, I scoop her up and run back inside the house and upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up in my arms. I decide to poke my head into my mum's room. Lying on the floor, sound asleep, is Ace, who had been here the whole time. I quietly close her door before bolting upstairs, making sure the little cat slept with me that night. From the research I've done, I am almost certain that I was a victim of a skinwalker. Okay, I posted a skinwalker encounter yesterday. I found it helped me, getting it off my chest and out into the open. Now this story goes into some of the details about injuries. The details are not too bad in my opinion, but you've had your warning. Now for some background, I was 16, around 2016 when this happened. I live in Massachusetts, which is where this happened. The day starts normally. I went to school, had a test in vet tech, and I took the bus home. Both my parents were at work like normal, but after 3 hours when my mum should have been home, I got worried. Around 5 PM, I got a phone call from my dad who told me that my mum's in a car accident and they're both in the hospital and they're going to be there for a while. It got very late, almost 10, and my parents weren't home, so I decided to put my younger brothers to bed. I stayed up waiting for my parents to get home. I spent my time reading and writing an essay for school until around 1 in the morning. I got a call from my dad who said that he wasn't coming home. He was staying in a motel that was closer to the hospital. I just got off the phone and finished that part of the essay that I was on. I gathered my stuff and walked through the kitchen, heading towards the stairs that leads upstairs when a terrifying loud moaning screeches through my ears. The moaning came from outside. I mean, it's super loud, but would stop occasionally. Like whatever it was had a voice crack, almost sounding pained. I turned on the outside light to see an ugly sight. Sitting in the yard just feet from my house is a coyote, horribly injured. Its head's caved in, its paws bleeding. This was evident by the pool of blood. It appeared that it had a long, deep gash all down its back. I reached in my pocket going for my phone, only to realise I left it on the table I'd been working on. Oh God. I turned and rushed back to the table. I was planning on calling a local vet clinic that I knew was open 24/7. When I reached the table, the moaning got much louder and more pained. Then it stopped. I grabbed my phone and ran back to the window. At first I was confused as hell. The coyote's gone, replaced by a common tabby cat. It was odd. The cat was sitting in exactly the same place that the coyote was sitting in. Weird. After the initial shock, I noticed that the tabby cat had the exact same injuries. Same part of the head caved in, same bleeding and gashes. Now I couldn't pinpoint the difference for a good few minutes, but then I realised that on the right shoulder blade it is exactly the same. I dropped my phone. As soon as my phone hit the floor, the cat starts meowing loudly. I'm now stuck here terrified as it meows at me. It's not even blinking. After a good 10 minutes, I slowly pick up my phone off the floor. I straighten back up and look out the window, and the cat's gone. It had only gone for a few seconds, and in that short time, it vanished. Some unknowing feeling come over me. I don't know what it was. Worry for the animal? Curiosity? Maybe. Hell, it might have been something that the animal made me feel. I have no clue. Now outside, I first walked to the blood puddle and looked for a trail of blood, and I found it. I started to follow the trail and found that it ended as soon as it got past the gates. To make sure that I just couldn't see it in the dark, I pulled out my phone and illuminated the ground. I looked for 5 minutes and don't find anything. Like the cat and trail had vanished. I called the veterinary clinic and they sent out a car. They look around for things, but they can't find anything. At the time I didn't think anything of this, but thereafter I realised there's no trail of blood leading to my house. I have no idea what this thing was. None of my searches have come up with anything. I'm honestly completely dumbfounded as to what this creature was. I only hope it wasn't a skinwalker attacking these. My wife and I were driving through the northern part of Arizona on Highway 89 between Flagstaff and Page. It's about 1 AM, as we're on the third shift at the time and often drove at night to avoid traffic. I saw a few set of eyes glowing in my headlights a little ways up the road, so I let off the gas, slowing down to avoid hitting an animal in the road. When we drove by, we see several dogs or coyotes on the side of the road, and I hit the gas and drove by. After we passed, my wife said, "One of them was running next to my car." and I looked over and saw it, probably 20 feet off the shoulder of the road. I floored it, and I see that it stood up on its own hind legs and kept pace with us for a couple of seconds before turning away from the road and disappearing. The whole event probably lasted no more than 15 seconds, but God, it is the most terrifying 15 seconds of my life. This was probably 20 years ago, and we still rarely talk about it. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they don't have electricity. And like many people there, they've been outside in the dark for about an hour, and my aunts and uncles are getting ready for bed. Outside, they hear noises, as though someone is moving things around them. My oldest uncle then went outside to see what's going on, and he saw a figure outside the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbour is miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through personal items. My uncles and aunts were frightened by the sight and knew they must take action. They took out the rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door, aiming the gun at the figure in the dark. They're shaking at this point. The figure then turned and starts towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happens. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotten corpse. It's so strong she began to gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger, no luck. The figure came closer and closer, but now, off in the distance, headlights are approaching. My grandparents are returning. The figure looks towards the lights and starts to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the home. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. That thing was poking out its head to observe what they're doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove, grabbing a handful of ashes and rubbing it over the gun, and placed an ash-covered bullet to the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards a tree. Whatever that thing was did not expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the figure began running. My grandpa chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit, the figure he saw a woman. Not only that, whatever it was running on its fours like a bear. My grandfather must stop now as they're nearing a ditch with a 30-feet drop. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and he knew it was her to leave the family alone. After a few days, there was the news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them. Out on the Navajo reservation, we don't have the city come and collect our trash, so we have to burn the trash out in these huge burning barrels. Not very eco-friendly, I know, but it's what we have to do. Now if you don't light the trash properly, the fire will go out and the trash will sit in the barrel. This is important because we are told to dispose of personal hygiene items. If you removed all your hair from your brush, make sure the trash burned. If it was that time, you had to make sure everything was burned. They tell us things because skinwalkers have been known to dig through trash in order to find out things they can use against us. They use the things that were briefly connected to bring misfortune onto others. Some of my family members take part in the sport of rodeo, so to practice, they have a dummy rope and throw it at things and try to bring them in. My two male cousins were enjoying themselves outside, taking turns swinging the rope at the fake calf. The elders are always adamant that we shouldn't stay out past sundown, where that it's pitch black for miles. But my cousins aren't superstitious and are under streetlight. My cousins are joking and laughing, having a great time. That changes when the oldest cousin looks over to a burn barrel. A dark figure is bent over, rummaging through the garbage that's failed to burn. My cousins devise a plan that they're gonna grab weapons and chase it. They move strategically so that they are able to flank the figure. They run full speed at it and begin yelling and swinging. My cousin states that they kept this up for the most part, until the figure ran under the streetlight. But that's when my cousins see that what they thought was actually a person is actually a goat. Why would they think it is a person? The goat was running on its hind legs. Fear runs through their bodies as the figure runs off into the darkness. Now feeling nervous, and not entirely accepting what they've just seen, they began roping the dummy again. There's an awkward silence amongst the boys who just saw something unnatural, but talking about it now would just make it seem real. The boys roped in silence until one of them looked over to a tree. There's a head peeking out at them. If they didn't pay attention to it, whatever it was would poke its head out from the tree to stare. When they would look in the direction of the tree, it would move quickly out of sight. This was the final straw. My cousins ran back into the house. They told their parents and my uncle come out. It was still there, poking its head from behind a tree. My uncle loaded up his gun and starts walking towards the tree line. He aimed it and pulled the trigger. Gun jammed. Whatever it was began to run so fast it appeared to be a blur. When it left, my uncle came in and gave the boys a thorough lecture about staying out late. One of my cousins then told my uncle that whatever it was had been digging through the trash barrel. They went to investigate the creature that's hauled a lot of things out of the barrel, which was odd. There were tracks all around the area. They followed the tracks, but they suddenly vanish, dead in the middle of nowhere, with no possible way they could have went. The Navajo Reservation is the largest reservation in the United States. It goes into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. This story takes place in the northeast region of Arizona, near Indian Wells. This was told by people from around that area. If you're heading west on State Highway 15, out towards Dilton, you come to a stretch of road that goes into a small valley. I remember going down this road in my youth. If you ever looked at the horizon, it would seem as if the road kept going. Then suddenly your car would be pulled down by gravity as though being followed by the road. It would always give me butterflies when we would get to the drop. When I heard about this story, it made my stomach feel different. A man was driving home one night and it's very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't bothered by it. When you're driving on the reservation, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences means that you need to be extra aware. I always get told to look out for black horses. If you see a black horse, then you'll be able to see anything else that may wander into the path of your vehicle. So this man is driving home, not really paying much attention. He drives down the slope, but when he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees it. He doesn't have time to react. Suddenly, a horse comes out of the darkness. He slams his brakes but can't stop. The impact is enough to deploy the airbags. The man is tossed around a bit. He turns on the emergency lights and gets out of the car to assess damage. The front of the car is crumpled and one of the headlights is destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was the worst place to have an accident. He didn't have signal for help. Then he thinks of the horse. This man went into his cab and got a small keychain flashlight. He starts shining around looking for the animal. He heard noises, but they don't sound like a horse. But he was absolutely positive that he hit a horse. As he approaches the sounds, he could see the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. An elderly woman wrapped in a large spelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks due to fear. He stumbled back to his truck. Although it suffered plenty of damage, he was able to drive off. Once he got signal again, he called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered her. She's then driven to the local care facility. Due to the fact that many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, no one wanted to touch the woman. The woman known in the community was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking because she was so far from home, and the state she was in was off-putting. She had on her attire when she arrived. The nurses called her family to come in. When she got there, they removed her jewelry. When her family got there, they were frightened. But there was some non-Navajo staff in there that provided care. She only had bumps and scrapes, which didn't make any sense at all. She's able to get up and walk around the same evening. She went home with her family that night, but apparently vanished after a few days. In Navajo culture, if you find out who a Skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around India Wells found out, or more fittingly who she was, it was certain that her end come. I had pet rabbits as a kid. They lived outside in a cage, a really big cage inside like a bigger shed, so they had a pretty good life. But I went out with my older sister to feed them. At the time we were about 5 or 7. On the way out to the cage, we both saw what appeared to be a really tall man running inhumanly fast through our backyard. We live in what is basically a swamp, and had to have cleared this giant downed tree and run over mud and ferns. But regardless, he seems to be going through at least 20 miles per hour. We both dropped what we had and bolt inside. At the time our parents are able to convince us it's a deer. We wanted to believe them, but it just wasn't. I convinced myself for over a decade that that's what we saw. Fast forward to a few years ago, I was at a park near my house with my friend late at night. I pulled into the dirt road drive in my Outback and parked facing the old practice fence. Now we go to the field that was too foggy to see across, except for a split second. We can see what appeared to be a very tall man running across the field. We drove as fast as that Subaru could take us out that park. Now a couple of years ago, I was at the same park under similar circumstances. This time, it was clear but very windy. Now from across the field and into a field, we heard a crash and a scream. Not a crash then a scream, but simultaneous. It was the most shrill, terrifying, god-awful screech I've ever heard. More human than a fisher cat, but far louder and more sinister. Again, we noped it out of there as quick as possible. So for context, I live in southern Maryland on a large plot of land. We have 3 large farm dogs, 2 of whom are German Shepherds. They're very used to the various animals that pursue our property, and very rarely get spooked or upset. We also have lots of livestock, and it's uncommon for us to lose a random animal or find a pile of chicken feathers in the corner of our property. However, we've always been able to explain it or add extra protection for our flocks. Around 8 months ago, we started losing chickens at an alarming rate. They would disappear. Even our shepherds couldn't send them anywhere on the property. For a while, we figured it's just a barred owl or some other bird of prey. The main problem with that theory is that literally 10 would disappear at a time rather than the normal 1 or 2. We decided to put a trail cam up to watch our most eastern flock. Almost immediately, the problem stopped, so we took them down. But then it got stranger. I've always gotten sleep paralysis, and it's like to believe I'm pretty comfortable with my sleep paralysis demon. It's never really been something to concern me. However, around the same time as we started losing chickens, I would see something different in my sleep paralysis. Whereas my demon would chill in the corner and not move, this thing would hang around and move back and forth, almost like a sloth. It had long fingers and was really skinny, like, weirdly. It didn't appear human. I then noticed it constantly stared at me, whatever part of the room I was in. At the time, I decided not to worry though, and figure it's just anxiety. Which brings us up to September 2018. One night at around 2, I woke up completely able to move my body. Everything seemed normal. No one else was sleeping in the house that night, but that's pretty standard around that time of year. I glanced up at my rafters and saw the long-fingered thing moving and looking at me. Immediately I turn on my bed lamp. It's gone, yet again. I talk it up to stress and decide to go downstairs to grab a cup of water. All of our dogs are happily asleep, and I went back to bed turning off the light. The second it was dark, I could see it again, without my eyes having to adjust. This freaked me out enough, but all of a sudden I heard a Rottweiler get up and start growling. He barks and growls. I call out, but he kept going. He got louder and louder until the other dogs joined in. Now, I turned the light back on, grabbing my hunting rifle. I went downstairs and took 2 of the dogs outside, and I swear to God, I've never heard a silent night like it. I moved my flashlight slowly around the perimeter looking for the shine of eyes, or anything. all of a sudden, the chickens are going haywire. Like so loud they distract the dogs, who sprinted out towards them. I followed them only to find no chickens, and our fence is torn down. There's no animals in the area that could even try to do that, so we quickly get inside and camped out for the evening. It was quiet after that, and when the morning came, the chickens are safely back home. I stupidly figured the problem solved and decided not to worry about it. The only thing was that I started seeing the long-fingered rafter thing every time I turned out the lights. Eventually I get so freaked out, I decide to call a shaman. She told us that we have a Wendigo problem, that she would come and sage the house. We opened every single window and door, letting her do her thing, but since then, we've had no problems. The issue now is that when we walk our dogs at night, or put the chickens inside, I swear someone's watching me. I've had a couple of other people bring up that they feel weird at night, and nobody goes outside alone anymore. Whenever we walk our dogs at night, they get so paranoid and don't want to move, especially not towards the forest. The creepiest part though is sometimes at night, we hear screaming. We assume it's often coyotes, but every once in a while, it's just off enough that we get scared. A couple of times it's been a lone shriek, which is very uncommon for foxes or coyotes, and a few nights ago, we were asleep in bed when we heard a scream from directly outside our window. My partner says that he's worried that someone was hurt, so he opened our window and yells, "Is anyone out there?" And we hear a lot of shuffling, like somebody scrambling off. It sounded heavier than a bird of prey, but way lighter than a person. Our dogs start barking, and within a minute, we hear another scream a good mile away. My ex-boyfriend and I did a rainforest walk, which dips deep down to the bottom of the forest. There's no other cars in the car park, and we didn't come across any hikers. We have it all to ourselves and had a great time for the most part. As we're walking up, my ex was ahead of me and suddenly stopped, raising his hand to signal for me to stop. I look up, and there's this woman staring at us ahead. She looks normal, but I get a chill as soon as I see her. Something about her's off. She had dark brown hair, which I only noticed because it contrasts so highly against her cardigan. Now her cardigan was all I could focus on. It went right down to her feet and was bleach white, as though it had just been pulled off a rack, but we're in a forest. How is it so white? And why on earth would you wear it hiking? We stare at her for what must have been 30 or 40 seconds, but feels like an eternity. There was no way I was going to take another step towards her. Instead, I felt this kind of stillness, as if the forest around us froze in time and went silent. She finally turned around and started to walk slowly back up the trail. We watched her and waited, not saying a word to each other, until she's out of sight before we start going again. The car park was still around half an hour away, and we just fast walked in silence, a bit on edge, just trying to listen for anything. We look back and don't see her. It's absolutely the strangest thing that ever happened to me. The one thing I can't explain was how her cardigan was perfectly white. Even the bottom of it had no signs that she had been in the forest whatsoever. It gives me chills thinking of it. This happened 1 year ago, over the course of 5 months, but I've decided now that I want to see other people's opinions on it. I live in a rural area with a few houses around but plenty of forest, and out of nowhere, around 10 to 12 at night, there would be a series of knocks on one side of the house, which isn't odd if it's one time, but this happened many times over the course of 5 months. If I had to put a number on how many times it happened, it's probably around 30. It's the exact same kind of knocking. At first, we thought maybe it's just some kids banging on the other side of the house, but no kid has enough dedication to continue it for this long with no reward. Also, I've stepped outside to see if anything's there, and literally, it's as if no one's there. I don't really believe in the paranormal, but I genuinely have no clue as to what this could be. When I was younger, I used to have this recurring dream that a girl in a white dress would come to me. At first she was harmless. She would never say anything to me. She would just stand at the foot of my bed and stare at me with these weird black eyes. Now it was almost like a lucid dream, because I would wake up in the exact setting that I fell asleep in every single time, whether I was staying at my grandma's house or if I was staying in my own bed. It would always happen. Now my father was a park ranger and a very strong man, so I always felt safe having my dad around. But there was one time that he wasn't around, and what happened I could never explain. Now, the exact same thing happened. I was so used to it. I wake up in the night, and there's a girl in that pure white dress just staring at me. This time, she raises her hand at me and wants me to come with her. I'm not going to hold her hand. I've rubbed my eyes and it feels like I'm not even in a dream, but I know that I am. She suddenly takes off and sprints outside, into the yard, then into the forest. Even in my dream mind, I still think, hell no, I ain't going out there. And I just go back to sleep. When I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that something was off about that dream. I kind of forget about it. A few years later, I hear off my dad that he's also had the same dreams, and some of the other park rangers have too that he works with, and he's never been able to explain it. He just thought it was nothing more than a dream. Well, that was until one day, I was out with my dad. We were just gonna go into the forest for a small hike together. I was really looking forward to it and always enjoyed doing so. As we get there, just on the tree line where the forest starts, my dad stops dead in his tracks. I've never seen my dad look so scared in his life, and this is literally someone that I've never seen be scared of anything. He says to me, "Don't move," and he goes and picks up a stick. I can finally see what he's looking at, and my god, it's terrifying. It was the exact same dress that the girl in my dream would wear. Literally as though it's just been placed there, no dirt on it whatsoever. My dad goes up to it and pokes it with a stick. We don't need to say anything to each other. It was the exact same thing that both of us had dreamt of. We both sprinted back to the house and agreed not to tell my mum about it, not to scare her. I found out later that my dad actually went there to go and investigate further to see if someone was playing a prank on us, but literally, later in that day, the dress vanished without a trace. It's the single most crazy and unexplainable thing that's ever happened in my life. If it was only me having the dreams and this experience, I wouldn't have been as scared, but the fact that my dad had it too? Crazy. Now my native language is French, so sorry if there's any problems telling this story. This happened last week. I was searching for a cave with my girlfriend, and in France, we have incredibly detailed maps telling us every cave that has been explored. We decided to go to a cave which has a famous area, and there's caves littering the landscape there. So there's a very wooded area. The hills and valleys are very narrow. We spot a good place to start looking at the bottom of a small creek and make our way up. We go to the dirt and then further into the gravel and then the boulder field. That's when I remembered this sub, because we stopped walking at the same time. It was silent. Dead silent. Not even a bird. It's the kind of silence that actually oppresses you. We eventually continued walking uphill and come across a cave. Soon after, a bird breaks the silence, and we realise we are almost dead for asphyxiation. We didn't dare to breathe in silence. Now, I've heard of other people having this before, but to experience it yourself is absolutely crazy. I mean, think, it wasn't something we heard that scared us, it was the silence. And it's not just that, you almost feel as though you're being stalked or someone's watching you. Maybe it's a primitive thing that lets us know there's a predator or person in the area, and the animals did the same. But there were no insect sounds either. That's what scares me the most. Usually I just think it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the fact that both of us stopped at the exact same time? Crazy. The details I have on this story are very vague, but someone told me about a teenager who went into the Apocaly National Forest to hike, and then was reported missing several days later when he didn't return home. A couple of months later, when he was found in the woods, he was a different person, appearing like he was drunk. He was tested but had no signs of drugs or alcohol. The negative results. Mentally, he wasn't all there, but physically, there's no signs of him being exposed to anything to cause this. He kept telling people that he encountered something strange. It was several months before he was himself again, and he had very little memory of what happened on those days. I've asked people that I know who live in Apocaly or have camped and hiked in the Apocaly National Forest, and they've never heard this story. I really didn't know this person who told me this story, but it's crazy. I do know that over the years, people have gone into the Apocaly National Forest and never came out. Some of them are harmed or killed by animals, others murdered by the worst enemy of all, humans, and never found again with a trace. Now, I've driven through the forest on State Highway 40, and it's creepy as hell. It's creepy enough in daytime. I guess I'll dive right into what happened, and not bore you with the unimportant details. I was hiking on a trail I'm very familiar with, and because of the changes in the weather, I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods. I wanted to try and get to my car before a downpour, and I knew this area like the back of my hand. Before I knew it, I felt very disorientated and nothing appears familiar. I'm not too sure if the woods seemed silent before or after I felt this way, but I become undeniably aware of how silent everything is. Oppressingly downright suffocating silence, and my heart began to pound as I stood in place, and it felt as though the woods were spinning and closing around me. It was like I'd stepped into something that I could not comprehend. It was then I noticed something about 15 feet in front of me. It was 10 feet high and about 8 foot wide and distorted. It was like something was bending the light and moving towards me, like a fogged up mirror almost, but with no definitive shape. But it was moving with purpose and intelligence, and would be completely unnoticeable if not for the distortion within and me directly looking at it. I turned to run, and realised another's behind me, the same size and shape. Almost then I realised that there's at least 4 of these things closing in around me, and I'm trapped. What I was seeing, my brain cannot make sense of, and I'm in utter panic, shocked and back up against a tree, terrified to run in the direction of those things. I curl up into the fetal position, pull my hands over my ears. They had begun ringing, and the sound was deafening. I closed my eyes as these intelligent-looking cloaked things were all around me, about 5 feet in height. I saw a white flash, like what happens if you ever hit the ground really hard. That's the best way I can describe it. My ears were ringing. The flash, then nothing. I woke up to rain falling on me. Hours had passed. Everything looks normal, and I knew where I was. I gathered myself, checked for injuries, and realised that, weirdly, I'm completely fine, and drove home. I can't make sense of what happened. I've googled similar events but found nothing quite like what happened to me. I have no history of mental illness or other things that could have caused this. I've stumbled across stealth cloaking technologies used by the military, and the technology is primitive compared to what I witnessed. I just don't have the answers, and I don't know what happened to me or why. I've never had anything like it since. I just hate this. I'm definitely going to be seeing a doctor tomorrow. I have no history of seizures or other health issues. I'm in my 20s and fit and sound of mind, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. And now this happened in Ireland, and I was in the Midlands, so I'd rather not be too specific. So my story isn't recent, but I needed to share this. I'm 19 now, but this took place when I was 12. It's something that's always stuck in my mind. The night this encounter happened, everything was pretty normal. I was going back to school the next morning after summer break, so I had to be in bed earlier than I wanted to be. I remember falling asleep to the movie Meet the Robinsons, playing at probably 10:30 p.m. And then I woke up, and I knew it had to be late, but the first thing that I registered was that the TV is completely scrambled. I mean, almost like a DVD that doesn't play so it skips. But it was frozen, so the image was warped and boxy. Except the Meet the Robinsons DVD was fine. At this point, I guess it's around 2 or 3 a.m. The second thing I registered was that there's voices coming from the kitchen. I got out of bed to see what was going on because the voices are talking really loud and sound panicky. When I got to the kitchen, I realised that it was my mum and older sister arguing. The first thing I actually picked up on and comprehended was my mum saying, "Those are definitely aliens, what else could they be?" Almost sounding hysterical. Neither of them saw me enter the kitchen, but I asked what's going on, and my mum looked at me, and I knew she's scared and shaken. She literally had tears in her eyes. She told me in an almost sad voice that aliens were outside. At this point, we're all standing in the kitchen in front of our sliding glass door that looks across the yard. There's a field there. I was confused, so she pulled back the curtain to the kitchen door, and I don't see anything initially. I don't look hard enough. But I then saw my huge dog, German Shepherd and Great Dane mix, sitting in the middle of the yard in the direction of the neighbours, which was to my house on the right side. I asked my mum why he isn't sitting on the porch like normal and why he's so still. To that she said, "You can slide the door very slowly, but don't make too much noise." And usually when the door to the house is open, my dog looks towards it and runs in, but he doesn't. He's still gazing. I didn't realise what was going on, but I was scared because my mum was clearly scared, as my older sister is too. My mum signalled to my sister and I to be quiet, and we were. On a normal night, you can hear animals in the woods, or the trees in the wind, and crickets chirping because it was summer, but that night, we can't hear anything. It's completely silent outside, not even a breeze. This gives me chills that makes me shake. Something's terribly off. My mum shut the door, and my sister and I followed her to the bedroom where my dad was asleep and the windows open. She explains what's going on. She told me that my sister is in my room looking for something and peeks out my window. My room is in the back of the house and my window looks out to the trees behind the house. She saw what she thought was a pack of coyotes, but there's 30 of them, and the closer she looks, she starts to see distinguishable features, and that's when she dipped out of the room and told my mum. But before she could get there, my mum said that she walked outside before my sister came to say what she saw, and saw a tall, dark, slender figure walking down the neighbour's driveway towards our house. She thought it was a neighbour coming over for some reason, but then she suddenly got scared and felt it's best to pretend she's asleep so she wouldn't have to talk to the neighbour. And those events lead us to go into the kitchen window that overlooks the neighbours' houses right next to each other. It's dark. I'm looking very hard and I can see shadowy figures. Most of them are small and very quick, so fast that if you weren't paying attention you wouldn't have noticed, and if you paid even more, you could see the slower, taller ones. They move slow and the silhouettes are darker than their background, almost fluid looking. It doesn't look real at all. And this sucks, but we didn't even think about grabbing a camera and trying to get pictures, which is something I regret. Another thing I noticed that's worth mentioning was that behind the neighbour's house they had woods too. Well within the trees and very low to the ground, there were 3 evenly spaced out lights. One was green, one was red, and another's bluish. The lights were pretty dim. They were never there before though. We watch out the window for about 10 minutes freaking out. My mum almost wheezing because she's so scared. After that, she took us into her room and opened the window more, which I didn't like. It made me more scared. She says be quiet, and since we couldn't hear anything at all coming from outside, we sit in silence until we heard what sounded like a car passing. And we hear the engine sound, but we can just about make out the road from my mum's window, and we see no cars, no headlights, nothing. The engine buzz was loud and turned into something like a plane passing over the house. This lasts for about a minute. Then it's completely silent again. After a few minutes the sound would repeat. Eventually, after all this happened, my mum shut the window and the curtains and we sat there shaking. Another thing to point out was that I did eventually work up the courage to go back to my room, but that was a few hours later and it was getting light out. The TV scrambled so I eject the disc, and it's not working, so I ended up unplugging the DVD player to get it off the screen. That's about all that happened that night, but it freaked me out so bad that it makes me cry thinking of it. Not to mention that I wasn't the only one that saw it. I hate that I even witnessed this at such a young age. It was truly horrifying. A lot of you wanted to know my cousin's story on the Skinwalker, but I'm going to try and get to the actual story from him tomorrow and fill you in there. I do have another one though that I'd like to share, however. This one doesn't have anything to do with Skinwalkers, at least I don't think so. There was an old legend about a lost town in the forest near where I lived, and for the most part, it was only a legend. However, it was noted as being true, and a ghost town is near my town. The story that I'm about to tell is one that happened when I was 11 and still scares me to this day. My dad likes to take me on the little off-road rides in his Jeep. It wasn't necessarily an off-road one either. It was a Cherokee, so it wasn't really built for the backwoods dirt trails. He decides to do this and go throughout a park with me and told me that it's going to be fun and we could go and check out the ruins of an old building. We decided along the way that we're going to have a real good exploration here. There was one of those official vehicles only gates on this dirt road we come up to, and usually that would stop people, but my dad just decides to break the lock and push it open anyways. My father was ever the best to listening to rules, but sometimes he had to break them. About 30 minutes into our drive on this road, he's shining a flashlight out of the window, trying to find this building, and he has his headlights on full. We're both looking for signs of, well, anything. Eventually we come upon this really steep hill. He says, "Oh, I think I remember this," and just guns it up there. Naturally, we get stuck at a certain angle. We can't reverse or accelerate. My dad never likes to admit when he's wrong, and said he can fix it, and started thinking that he's going to be able to fix this really easily. I was very curious, and I still am, and I got the flashlight and started looking into the woods around us. I'm kind of worried about bears or wolves, to be honest. I then noticed a little light in the valley below us, and turned off the flashlight to see it. At the same time, my dad's cursing at our car, and I decided to get a little closer to the light and see if I can figure out what it was. Mainly to see if there was somebody who could help us. As I got closer to it, the trees took it apart a little bit, and I can see there's a very small town. The best way I can describe it is like a town from the movie Big Fish. Just very numbered set of buildings. As I got closer, I hear voices, and I saw people. But something just seemed really weird, like they weren't really there. I decided to try and get closer to the town, but the closer I get, the more weirded out I feel. I eventually felt if I didn't turn around, I would never come back, which is very odd, and I've never had this feeling before. I decided to turn around and go back to my dad. He didn't get the car unstuck by himself, at least, and we just slept in the car. The following morning, the park ranger showed up, and after a lengthy talk with my dad and a very hefty ticket, he helps us get the car unstuck and be on our way. Before we left, I try and catch another glimpse of the village, and it was the ruins that my dad was talking about. I talked to the park ranger about it, and he said, well, this was once a thriving village, just lost in time. I decided not to say anything about what I saw to the park ranger, but did tell my dad, but his usual skepticism turned me away. I have visited since, and it's a pretty decent place, and I told my friends about what I saw, and they believed me for the most part, and we decided to stay out one night to try and find it and see if anything happened, but of course nothing did. But I still remember that night as if it was yesterday, and I still get goosebumps thinking of it. I went hiking with one of my old friends. He used to be homeless and in a bad situation with his parents, so I let him stay with me until he got back on his feet. One evening, before he officially started staying, we went one day into the woods to get his stuff from an area that he was posted up at during the night. It's probably 11 PM when we meet up. I got off work late. We go to the woods to pick up his stuff, and we kind of get lost in the dark. It was abnormally dark considering the full moon was fixing to come around from its phase. Neither of us have flashlights, and my phone had died, so I can't use it. Bad planning, I'll admit that. We stumble across a bunch of decently large moulds of dirt in the offshoots of the woods. Each mound had a small tree growing from the middle and a crude blank sign at the tops. By this point it's eerily quiet, considering we're very close to the deepest part of the woods where there should be lots of sounds. We eventually found his campsite and hurried out. Outside of the woods now, we're walking down a one-way street leading to the main road. A large moving truck comes our way and slows and passes by us. We pay no mind to it and just nod and keep going. The truck turns around and pulls into a little offshoot, stopping parallel to us with the engine on. The driver gets out and watches us. We weren't being conspicuous or anything by looking back, just glancing over the shoulder here and there. Nothing you can make out in the darkness from the distance has anyhow. We're almost at the top of the street, and we're near my car when he goes back in his truck and I guess opens the back door. The next thing we hear is 3 large dogs barking their heads off and a flashlight pointing our way. We started running and had to do some evading through neighbourhood streets before we could get back. Nothing ever come of it. No cops, no local town chatter, nothing. I still have no idea what we ran across, but I knew we shouldn't have been there. I have a horrible feeling that this could have ended a lot worse for us. So this happened about 15 years ago to my brother and me, and I still can't come up with a satisfactory logical answer to our experience. For detail, this happened in Ontario, Canada, and we were 8 and 5 at the time. It's in a suburban area, built around a medium-sized forest, and our house backs onto the woods. We were driving home with our mum, and we were arguing. She told us to get out and walk the rest of the way. She dropped us off in front of the woods at the playground. There's a connected public path leading back up through the woods to our street. It's about a 5-minute walk away, and a small hill between the playground and the main road. We weren't pleased that we got in trouble, so we made up quickly and start playing on the sliding swings. My brother goes up and says, "Hey, who are those guys?" I look over and saw 2 men dressed in black suits, white shirts and black sunglasses coming over the top of the hill towards us. They're walking briskly and purposely in our direction. They had brown hair, not close cropped but short and fairly pale skin. It's beyond bizarre. It scared me immediately. I told my brother to come down the slide and we have to go home. They had already unnerved him enough that he actually listened to me. We started down the path, and when I look over my shoulder, they're still coming towards us quickly. That was horrifying, so I start to walk even faster, holding my brother's hand. Maybe 30 seconds later, I looked behind me again, and they've started running. They're gaining on us. That pushes us over the edge, and I scream at my brother to run home as fast as he can. I know he's quicker than me. I think he's going to be able to tell my parents if we're going to be kidnapped. I have honestly never ran so fast in my life, and we didn't look behind us again until we made it home. Our parents were still unloading the groceries and were surprised. They figured out that we had spoken to someone, and they couldn't really understand exactly what happened as the men never said a word. They're accompanied by a wall of silence. Neither of us have ever experienced anything like it again, and it wasn't until a year later that I watched the BuzzFeed Unsolved episode about Men in Black that I realised what I had encountered. My dad and I went on a hiking trip a few days ago. My dad is a waterfall fanatic. He wants to see as many as possible. So he and I are hiking along a very pretty trail. We're hiking along a river. It's flowing nicely. There's mountains all around us. The trail is weaving around big, beautiful boulders. I'm hiking at most 30 feet ahead of him, looking for a spot to sit down and have picnic lunch on. And as I round a blind curve in the trail, I just freeze. Sitting on a stump, maybe 10 feet off to the right, is a guy. But he's wearing one of those colourful badger hoodies. With the hoodie pulled up, he's wearing a Halloween-style bunny mask. He sees me and stands up right after my dad rounds a corner. We are all three sizing each other up in silence, and my dad addresses him. "What's up, buddy?" The masked man then tips his head as though he's deciding what to do with us. He then finally speaks, saying, "Oh, not much. You aren't the guys I'm waiting for. You have a good day." And then he turns and jogs off quickly. Strapped on his lower back is a large hunting knife and a pistol. We lose sight of him pretty quick. We hadn't seen a soul on the trail all day, and we'd been there for almost 4 hours. Needless to say, we leave the waterfall for another day and turn quick. Once we're off the trail, we report it to the local forest service and police, but they say they can't do much aside from keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. Now, the guy had no backpack or water or anything, which makes me think that he either had it stashed somewhere or was camping nearby. I hate to admit it, but I desperately wanted to ask the guy who he was looking for and why. Let me start by saying that I love camping. Anytime my friends and I come home from college, we loaded up our cooler with beer, grab some gear and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or friends ever wanted to go with me, so I often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed my gear, hopped in my car I borrowed from a buddy and drove to a spot that's secluded yet within safety of civilization if I need to get help. Camping also creeps me out though, but that feeling is always outweighed by the joy of it. So I make a little camp and a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much, but I'm enjoying myself reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling that I'm being watched and stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, but see a doe vault from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to camping. I just kept freaking myself out though, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whistling and just enjoying myself. Around 1, I decided to get into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I'd been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars until I passed out. It's around 2 AM. I hear footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or some animal, maybe a raccoon, but I'm on guard. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open later, and I hear a rubbing sound and the tent fabric being pushed in a bit. I don't know what to do. I'm paralyzed with fear. I desperately wanted to go and get the knife and stab this person, but I think maybe it's one of my buddies messing with me. Suddenly, it stopped. I was starting to feel more secure because daylight's coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I'm sure as hell not gonna sleep. All of a sudden, it's about 4 o'clock. I realise I should have my boots on in case anything were to happen. After having stayed up and keeping alert for a little longer, my friend's car alarm goes screaming. I sprint out of the tent. I got about 2 steps out before something grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead, the person stops me. I've heard that people can perform insane feats of strength with adrenaline rush. In my case, I just clamped down. His finger popped off almost. He screamed and pulled his hand away. He took off, running down the hill and into the opposite direction. I take off. I must have looked ridiculous, but I didn't care. I quickly make it into the car and speed it out of there, calling up my friends, telling them what's happened and the police, and get some real clothing. When the cops get there, they checked it out. The cops went out with a light. They brought me back some of my things that I left there. But what made me most scared is that right next to the tent was a gas can, and lighter fluid had been poured around my tent. The kicker is, they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there is some crazy guy that's looking to make fires in tents with people in them. Growing up, every summer in July and August, my family would get together and camp out for 2 weeks at the White Lake State Park in Tamworth, NH. Some of my best childhood memories were made there, with rollerblading, Nerf gun wars, etc. Now when I was around my late teens, my family stopped gathering together to camp out after my grandpa passed away. One of the last years I was there, this one particular memory always stuck with me. A little over 10 years ago, I was 16 years old. It was around 10 PM at night when I noticed I had a missed call on my cheap little track phone. My family was sitting around the campfire cooking s'mores and sharing some laughs, so I decided to go and get some privacy to return the call. I then took a long narrow trail that winds in between other campsites that, at the end, leads up to the bathroom. I wasn't going up to the bathroom. I just wanted to find an empty campsite and sit at a picnic table to make my call. There was plenty of those, since this whole side of the campground was where I'm going and it's vacant. There was no other campers nearby in that area. It was quiet and dark, so I chose a campsite. I sit down at a table. There's lights from a distance that light up from behind the top of the hill behind me, illuminating my surroundings just a bit. I called my friend and was carrying on a conversation for around 20 minutes. As I'm sitting there, staring straight ahead, I see the silhouette coming down from the road in front of me. The figure is coming towards my direction, where all the empty campsites are. I can see it's a person. It's not that unusual to see people strolling through the campsite for a night walk. The people I see usually have flashlights, so this person doesn't, but I'm not creeped out, just curious. As the person gets closer, I can see the outline better now, and that it's a man. I also noticed his pace slows down. I kept my eyes fixated on him as I continue conversing on my cell phone. A minute or two passes by now, and now he stopped moving. He's just standing there in the road looking straight into the campsite where I'm at. Now I don't know if he can see me. Oh wait, he can now. He's staring at me. I step back. He was a little heavy and tall. I can make out he's wearing a jacket. I can't see many facial features, but I would guess that I was staring at a man in his late 40s or 50s. Alarm bells are going off in my head now. My mind has turned to mush at this point and I'm frozen. I was no longer listening to what my friend is saying. I just stare off at this guy. He starts moving now. He was tiptoeing towards me, very carefully, like he didn't want to make a sound. He put one foot in front of the other, leaned forward in a slight hunch form. It looked as though he was charging towards me. In that moment, I snapped out of my mind-mushy frozen state and leaped forward off the picnic table and began running through the campsite back towards the trail. Thud, thud, thud. I can hear him getting closer now, leaves scuffling, heavy yet fast footsteps. Footsteps were getting louder and closer. I made it back to that narrow trail. Once he gets close to whereabout I was, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and the sound of someone annoyed that they've tripped or hurt themselves. Most likely he wasn't familiar with the trail like I was. Whatever the reason it was, it causes him to just stop. I don't stop looking back. I just keep running and running until finally I make it back to my family's campsite. When I got back there, they're still having laughs and smiles by the campfire. I break down crying and I'm trembling. I explain what happened, and my aunt woke up and said, "Oh God." He probably thought that he was someone he knew and was doing it as a joke, dismissing me. My cousin saying, "Yeah, he probably stopped running after he realised he didn't know you, idiot." I wish I was taken seriously, but other than that one thing happening, there was no reason for them to really be afraid. My experience makes me think twice about going alone camping now. I always carry pepper spray with me too, and an alarm. I hope I never see that guy again. Now, while I was growing up, my family would visit the same lake every year for every summer weekend. As we got older, we would visit a large rock we called the Cliffs and jump off it. The rock's only about 15 feet tall at the highest point. For the water, that's really deep. When we got older, we would jump in and try and touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens, we took our kayaks to the cliff's edge to jump on our own. We jump off several times. We then find a nice cold spot at the very top of the cliffs and chill there for a bit. As we're sitting there, we notice a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It's the letter H. Eventually, it sank back into the water and we lose sight. Before we can look away or even say anything else, another shape was floating upwards, the letter E. Eventually, it too sank below, but it was followed by two more letters, L, P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up without saying a word and left. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it even happened. Several years ago, I was working as a camp counselor and told this story as a ghost story. I'd almost forgotten about it and texted my brother to see if I hadn't made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we jumped off the cliffs and saw something in the water. He said yes. I asked him what it was and he too said it spelled out help. One of my friends always has these get-rich-quick schemes or shady ways of making money on the side. Now, in one of his more brilliant moves, he decides that he's going to rent a house out near the country line to host illegal poker games in. Yep, Anyway, on this property is probably 4 or 5 acres with this tiny rundown church about 1,000 yards away on the side, and there's a redneck guy who lives on the side in a trailer probably a quarter of a mile or so down the road. However, the property backs up to the woods, and since it's always cheaper than the range, and I and a third friend ask our renter friend if we can go shoot some guns on the property. He obliges us, and we head out there on a Saturday afternoon and find a nice berm at the tree line to shoot into. Now we're just shooting paper targets with pistols, so we're not that far back, and don't need that much room to do so. After a few magazines, we decide to venture deep into the woods to see just how far the property goes. Now we get down to the bottom of the hill and see fluorescent ribbons that the server ties to the trees to mark property lines. We realise that the property is way bigger than we ever thought before. We're already 200 yards into the woods now. Now just as we're remarking how big it is, we see a dead animal about 10 yards away from the property line. Walking up to examine it, we see that it's a goat that's had its head cut off, clearly done by a human. Then we see a severed goat head a little further away. Now the really creepy part to this is that it's not the same goat. There's 2 separate ones, and clearly due to the decay, it's been multiple days apart. Now if we weren't armed it would have been way scarier, but it's still creepy because I fear humans more than anything in the woods now. Now I say this was out in the country, but it's in South Carolina, so there's really not crazy expanses of wilderness being an East Coast state that's pretty much all settled by people. The thing that gets me now is that there was a serial killer call not too long ago around the time we were there, and apparently he started on animals too. This happened in the summer in northern Ontario, Canada, near the town of Parry Sound. Me and my friend had headed up north to spend some time at my grandpa's cabin. He shares it with a few other hunters next to a very big lake. You need to take a boat to get to the cabin, I mean. I had gone up there a few weeks prior just to wander around and help my dad with some repairs and improvements to the cabin. I looked on a printout of a satellite map, and I found the area that the cabin's in. There was no Wi-Fi in the cabin, and it's sort of in a valley, and it was very hard to get any sort of signal in. And I noticed that there was a small lake north of the one we're at, and there was a small island inside the lake. Me and my dad go to the boat and found a nice pristine little island. We don't actually go on it though. We can see that there's some swampy areas and a small fiberglass boat that hunters use to hunt ducks sometimes. The lake was much higher than the one we come from, and it would have been impossible for us to take the boat that we just come in to get up the hill. Me and my friend head back to explore the island. We headed up the hill and noticed there's a small gorge that led into the lake. It used to be a river but was blocked up by a beaver dam. Me and my friend start to walk through it, and I start to feel uneasy because of the increase of bugs in the gorge, and being slightly afraid of running into a beaver. It turns out my friend was feeling the same too, and we don't know why. He just felt that there was something weird about the lake. We left the gorge and made our way up to the top of the hill. We overturned the boat, and after a few failed attempts of trying to launch the boat, we make it to the lake. Now I must say that I'm almost 6'4" and my friend's 5'7", so it's a challenge to get us in the boat, along with there only being one oar. We eventually made our way to the middle of the lake, aiming for the island, with my friend rowing the boat. We both feel very uneasy, but I put my mind off and try and distract myself a bit. Now, I'm bored and being in a small boat, see if we could tip over if one of us sneezed for a laugh. We're almost 2 hours away from a town or hospital though, so we're both kind of worried about getting stranded at the time. We're in the middle of the lake with a small swamp in front of us and a rock face around 20 feet from our left and the woods to the right. We could see the water around us moving, the wind creating a slight wave. We carefully looked below us to see if we had hit a sandbar, but we didn't see any sand beneath us, just inky black waters of the lake. We put the oar in the water and don't feel any current. We found though that we could move to the left and right, but just not forward, almost like we hit an invisible wall in a game. We both felt that the boat starts to sink down a little, almost like being sucked into the lake. Now, my friend started to row to the right and we make our way to the right, then once near the coast to the island. Far away from the island, seems to be nice and pristine, but once we get closer, it's desolate. The trees are dying or dead. The island's covered in stone and pine needles and dead lichen, with swamp and decay covering the lake. We managed to tie up the boat next to a dead pine tree, and we spend some time on the island checking it out and looking for anything of interest. After spending some time on the island and running out of bug spray, we decided to head back to the cabin. My friend took the oar and started to prod the water around off the island to find a good place to stay. Around this time, we both get this grave sense of unease. Personally, it felt like dread, kind of mixed with anxiety, like your body saying, "Get out of here now or you're gonna die." We then hear some commotion in the water, and we look around, and 10 feet away from us we see some geese running into the water. And we look around, and right where they've come from, we see what appears to be a black sculpture/scroll behind some rocks. Kind of like a mix, I guess. The closest thing I can describe is the thing in Star Wars when Jawas go behind the rocks. My friend also said he heard a strange noise, but I didn't notice it. We also had noticed too that the lake had gotten awfully still, and that the forest fell silent. We found a good place to port, and we decide we're going to row back. As we start heading back, I look to where we started and see a strange black figure staring at us standing where we left. At this point, I didn't want to point it out, so just start rowing. I row for another 10 minutes and take a short break. But whenever we take a break, we could hear the crushing of leaves and breaking of branches following us in the woods. I hug the coast as we head back. Even when we're staying around 12 feet away from the shore, I can't see the bottom of the lake. We eventually got back and put the boat back where we found it. When we tipped it over, we find scratch marks all over the bottom of the boat as though something clawed it. As we start to leave, we decide to take one last look at the beaver dam. That's where we noticed there was a cave behind the dam. Upon seeing this, we decided to get the hell out and make our way back to the main lake, where we used our walkie-talkies to tell my granddad to come and pick us up. He's out with some hunting friends and we can't even get a signal at first, but eventually find him. Now as we left, I looked back and saw the figure standing on the island later that night too, as me and my friend were at a fire pit next to the cabin. We start hearing strange noises coming from the woods, almost sounding like a person trying to make a hoot sound of an owl. Although this could have just been my grandpa's hunting buddies in the cabin, but why would they do that? Now the land itself used to be Owaja, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any kind of story similar to mine. At first, I'm sorry for any mistakes. English isn't my first language. So as a child, I had a very traumatic experience. You can believe it or not, but this is what happened to me and why I'm still scared of the dark. When I was younger, I can't say exactly how old I was, about 4 I think. My big brother and I loved to camp outside our home. In front of the house there was a small forest. If you went outside, you stood directly in front of this really small forest. There was never anything spooky about it. We even played in it. Even when it was just a steep slope with trees. It was our favourite place to be. Just playing, doing stupid things. Being a child, it was always my favourite place and a happy one. One day, we decided to camp outside again. We built the tent at night and we're inside it keeping warm. Everything looks normal. I'm not afraid at all. Also, brave enough to be like 15 meters to the entrance of a toilet in the middle of the night. I went in. A few minutes later I come back. I don't even look at the forest whatsoever. Do you know the feeling like somebody's watching you? Well, I have that. I had the feeling that I need to stop and look in the forest, so I stopped. I stopped to look at the forest, and there's 2 glowing red eyes staring back at me. I was frozen in fear, and I ran back to the tent into the safety, shivering in fear. Now I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't a car because there's no roads nearby, and my brother said he saw them too, so I know it wasn't just me. It couldn't have been a predator because there was no light to make the eyes reflect, and they were far too big. I've literally never seen anything like it, and I always get scared of forests today because of it. There is something my sister experienced about a week ago, which was similar to an experience a friend of hers had a month before. She was sleeping at her boyfriend's house, which backs onto a mountain with a forest starting in his backyard, when she decided to go get herself some food from upstairs. Her boyfriend refused to go with her as he had school in the morning and it's already 1. His room's in the basement, so she went up the stairs to the kitchen, on the same level as the rest of the family's bedrooms. Because she didn't want to wake up everyone else, she used her phone flashlight while she prepared herself bananas and hummus. While doing so, she heard what sounded like large footsteps. It actually sounded like a dog, but they don't have any pets. The door opens and closes about 3 or 4 times before finally closing. Then, the footsteps progress down the hall in her direction to a closet door where the same thing happened. Only this time, the door was left open. She's starting to get freaked out now. She tries to brush it off as a family member and went back to chopping her banana. Out of the corner of her eye though, she saw what appeared to be a very large black figure slowly leaning its way around the hallway corner, trying to look into the kitchen. She looked up and it's gone. The same thing happened again. Only this time its neck is stretched out longer than before, looking at her. She looks up and finally catches a glimpse of something with white glowing eyes before disappearing around the corner. At this point, she's freaked out and grabs her knife. She quickly went around the corner to turn the light off, before gathering all of her stuff to head downstairs. When she told her boyfriend in the morning, he told her that the closed door is not just a closet door, it's an empty room with the attic door in the ceiling. They went in the room the next day to find that paint had been scratched off the attic door and the floor was scratched beneath it. A friend of hers had a similar incident a month or so earlier when he was taking a leak in the backyard. He looked up only to see a tall creature with what he described to be glowing eyes and huge teeth standing amongst the trees. Once it notices him, it ran off, but then started coming after him once he started running towards the house. I work out in a very isolated stretch of the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and I've had an alarming amount of strange experiences while out here. The basic thing that happens are humans screaming far away in the woods. It's a really dense rainforest with no trails. Hearing high-pitched voices say one or two words like again or thank you. Sometimes I'm all alone, and sometimes my boyfriend hears them too. There is a really upsetting presence that sometimes appears to be a tall shadow that crouches and peeks out from behind things in a dumpster area, and all but a couple of co-workers have had unpleasant experiences while taking the recycling out. Another friend saw a face gliding by her window like it was on a skateboard looking in. Until recently, it's been mostly ghost happenings around here, but in the last week, we've had a few things that are different. I mean, like strange lights. The first thing that happened was my boyfriend and I are out in our bedroom, and we're flooded with an intense bright light. We just stare at each other for a while, confused as to what this is. The light then flickers on and off, and the room went black to pitch darkness. Avram backs off onto a dense forest, and we promptly look outside to make sure nobody's there, as this is a national forest, but there's no one. There's nothing but darkness and no movement. 2 nights ago, a co-worker of ours was returning home late at night when he got out of his car, and he can see an orange light hovering over one of the housing units. It does a couple of loops before popping out of sight. Now, the thing that worries me is that these are becoming more consistent. I spoke to a park ranger and he has no idea what they are either. I hope these stop. So a little while ago, I watched a news broadcast on my local news channel. It's about a woman that went missing 2 months ago. The circumstances of her disappearance were odd. She was staying in a family cabin in the woods, and she said she got in a shootout with 2 men, claiming she shot one in the face. She frantically called her friend and told her these things. The specific things she said is unknown. The police found bullet holes and other evidence that suggests there was a shootout, but they find no blood anywhere, despite her saying she shot one in the face. Her belongings are found, and it's all on the roof, and she's been missing ever since. There's no sense of this, it's like she literally just vanished. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even myths around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now, my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid, and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experience is night hiking. We would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now, the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water You'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and past the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. You'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like, good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone, at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. There's stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now, and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time, and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground, it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, "This feels much longer than it should be," and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, he kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail, whatever it's called, is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both of his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long, and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we're even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we're all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further, and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall, and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012, I was 16, and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "Do you know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this." She mentions, "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 90s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies and the long greasy hair barely holding on the top of the head starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight at my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that there's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances did they touch or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30 and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them. Because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, the trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walked into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe, one hell of a name, were outside all the time when we could manage it. Joe, the real G, lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we're frontiersmen. We'd build lots of traps, shelters, and practice making fires with sticks. Basically the whole 9 yards. Now when we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the rail tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find a cool bridge to fish from, and camp out a little way off the track. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we're probably trespassing, but we're young and kids. Now we had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was very calm actually. Now after school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd occasionally see each other. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we're both in the same town for about a week. We'd do other stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer and a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day just to walk the trails, camp one night and walk home. The day we decided on, we started out early in the morning. We actually had my wife drop us off in the old spot we used to start in, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave her what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We sat on the bridge and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff before the night set in. We picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train track, and it made you feel as though you're in a tunnel. We brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. Now this is actually what we used to do in the old days. We'd walk the area and make sure that we're not just on some guy's house or something. We walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and end up on a small incline. We figured if we don't see anything from the top of this hill, we'll be good. But when we get to the top of the hill, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, which is barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't appear to be anyone in it. It was quiet, with no movement that we can see, no lights even. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly as we near the building, and we see it's not a sugar shack, but it's an old church. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building with wooden planks that are busting out from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of that place, also weathered and black, looking creepy. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see the inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section for a preacher to stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't wanna. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anyone, not even footprints. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot, and we decided to camp there. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel safe, but we're still a little uneasy. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods in the middle of nowhere. Besides, at this point it's dusk and we decide to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep. By this time night set in. Now as we lay in our hammocks, we're talking and we hear something in the direction of the church. What the hell's that? It sounds like people singing. Yeah, I know, man. And it did sound like people singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and they're singing, but it's not getting louder. We decide to creep back up the hill to see if we can spy on whatever that is. We could move very quietly in the woods. We're used to it from before and it's like second nature now. The moon was barely out and it provided just enough light so you couldn't really see us. We didn't touch our flashlights as we slowly got up the hill, not even whispering. We got to the top of the hill and we see a light in the distance. It was coming from the church. Singing? Well, it's from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and hushed conversations to each other. Can you hear this? I don't believe this. Craziest thing is that the light appears as though it's coming from a candle and flickering. And though we tried, we can't make out what's being sung. It sounded like church music but in another language. We sat there for a while, trying to see who was in there, but only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer. We have about a football field's length between us now. The singing has continued for a bit, but stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I'm already freaked out, but this voice scared the life out of me. It sounded like an Old Testament preacher that you see in movies, but again, speaking in another language, we can't differentiate any words. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, then a bunch of voices would answer. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into the song, which is long and sustained and gets louder and louder. It got so loud it was actually disturbing enough that I covered my ears. It stopped now. At this point, I was getting ready to say, let's get out of here, when Joe puts his hand on my shoulder and says, yeah, they're coming. We're far enough away that we can't make them out really, but we can literally see a line of figures walking out of the hallway, all in single file. Some of them have flashlights and began to sing again. They're moving towards us. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks into the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, erratically like they're shaking them. We sprint as quick as we can. We eventually stop seeing the lights and come to our road, but our map is really small and we're struggling to read it. We walk for about 15 more minutes and know where we are. We get to a gas station and my wife gets us. Now my wife and other friends say it's just kids messing around, but there was no way kids made them sounds. Not sure who these people were, but it definitely creeps me out. I remember that happening to me in Ohio. I'm doing seasonal work out in the Olympic National Park this summer and live in employee housing on the same property as my job. Throughout the summer, I've heard things like a giggling coming from an empty room and a sliding door that closes on its own. Now one night about a month ago, something wild happened. The building I live in is backed up against an impenetrable coastal rainforest, and some friends and I were sitting in one of the apartment unit cabins chatting when, all of a sudden, we hear screaming coming from directly in the woods. Initially, we thought it's a cougar, but it kept going and was decidedly human sounding. Sometimes it seemed more like a sobbing, and in others it was frantic yelling. It literally goes on for 5 minutes straight, then stops. Now the truly chilling part, about 30 seconds after the yelling stops, we heard what sounded like a disembodied woman's voice coming through a radio that starts muttering right next to where we're sitting. We can't make out what she's saying, and it's only for a few seconds, but it's literally in the room next to us, and we can't see anything around. One of my friends opens the door to make sure there's nobody outside, and we're completely alone. It should be added that everyone who lives in the buildings were all in the same room. Everything else was empty. Though the voice lasted for a few seconds, it stayed with me forever. When I was about 9, my family was in a big transitional phase. We moved out to a house deep in the woods in the country, and my mother to this day insists that it's haunted. My sleepwalking got really bad in those days, I mean incredibly. Sometimes I'd wake up on dirt, outside, with a blanket wrapped around me. I would look around in darkness for a light, and that would usually be my house porch light. It got so bad that my mum kind of barricaded me in at night with chairs sometimes. What scared me most, however, was not outside in the woods, near the national forest, no. It was my room. It was on the first floor, and with the layout of the house, it was on a silent kind of slanted hill. It dug into the ground a bit. It was the closest thing to a basement possible, because it dug into the ground. There was only one window in my room. This window is in the top right corner of my room, and it was tiny. The window was right at ground level outside, so most of the time I would only see thick grass and dirt covering the glass. Sometimes when I woke up in the night though, I would see other things. Often, I saw boots standing there. They would stand there for hours at a time, facing inwards as though someone's staring at the wall, facing me. They were steel-toed, or looked like old leather boots. It looked as if they belonged to a man. It was so weird. The boots shifted weight sometimes back and forth, between one side and the other, as though the wearers lean in. The toe area was always scuffed too. I knew that they weren't my mother's or father's. It wasn't sleeping paralysis. I was always able to move in that. I would just sit and stare at these boots until I fell asleep. And for some reason, I always had the urge to never go and tell someone, and I don't know why. My family's already freaking out about the other experiences in the house, so I guess I didn't want to add to it. It stopped when my dad moved. Years later, and with the family camping, and all of us are telling scary stories, my father begins talking about how when he was young, he would have the sensation that something was slowly walking towards him. Has anyone ever seen it in a movie? Yeah, like that. He just explained like a pair of shoes that slowly walked towards him with malevolent intent. He goes on to explain how it stopped when he got older. I get this sour taste in my mouth. I ask my father if they're still toes. He shoots this weird look at me and nods. I say, are they made of old, dusted leather and scuffed at the front? He looks scared now and nods. He said, how do I know? And I explain my story, and he begins freaking out. It was so insane to make these realizations at the same time. And my father's room was right above mine, so someone with average height to that specific spot would have been right through to my dad's window. I've concluded that my father has spirits that follow him. I now know that they weren't there for me. I just hope they can stop. It was mid-December 2010. I was 16. I was off school for the half term and was playing video games all day basically. I lived in a small 3-bedroom semi-detached house. Due to my bedroom being upstairs and fairly small, my mum let me have the back room downstairs as my room too. This had all things in there like my PC, reptiles and guitars. We also had some doors leading into the garden near the forest. One night at around 2 AM, I was playing World of Warcraft and using Ventural talking to my guide friends. Pretty standard night. At the time, my sleeping pattern was awful and I was staying awake all night playing World of Warcraft. I pretty much always had my back door a little tiny bit open to let some cool air in, due to the heat coming off my computer and to cool it too. This had never been a problem. We lived in a relatively quiet area. Now our garden backs onto a small wooded area, and the only people I ever seen in there were kids making dens and playing etc. Nothing really to be scared of. While having headphones in, I can't really hear anything outside, because of the game volume I mean. I remembered playing and catching something out of the corner of my eye. Now my PC desk is about 3 feet away from the double doors against the wall. Anybody outside would be able to see me sitting at the desk. I turned and saw a hand opening the door. I froze and remembered spinning around in my chair ripping out my headphones. This would be a pretty good time to add that I was home alone. My mum and dad were at a wedding party and I was fine staying home on my own. Then a man, who's about 30 years old with a shaved head and scruffy beard, is standing at my door. Well, we kind of stare at each other for a few seconds and I ask him to close my door and get out of the garden. But he just casually walked in and stood there. I remembered freaking out a little and standing up and moving to the other side of the room. I moved towards a shelf where I had a penknife and took it out and tell him to go away. He then said that, and it chills me, he knew nobody was home and says let me stay on the couch until my parents' car shows up. I freaked the hell out. He got visibly agitated and starts walking around my room looking at my reptiles. I told him that I'm gonna call the police. I remember not being as terrified as I should have been. It was only for the reason what the situation is that I couldn't really understand what was going on. He then said something along the lines of, "You know, I'll stab you long before the police ever get here." I remembered then going out of my room and shutting the door behind me, so he's locked in. I never heard him walk to the door or even try the handle. He then starts really pushing on it while screaming at me to move. I weigh up my options. It seemed like the best option would be to run out of the front door and knock on the neighbour's house, but my very small dog was asleep in the bedroom and I'm not going to leave him. I know my dad kept a police cosh in the cupboard in his bedroom, so I sprinted to get it. While rustling in the drawers, I hear him going upstairs. He's now making his way through my parents' bedroom, staring at me through the banister. I'm terrified. He has a steak knife in his hands now, which I didn't see before, and he raises it up to me. I had the kosh and a penknife, but I wasn't confident. He didn't move for a bit until I asked him what he planned to do because this isn't going to end well for us. He told me he's going to go back and walk down the stairs. I heard him go through my room. I hear him slowly go through the other side. I crept back down the stairs, but what made it more intense is for some reason he turned off every single light. Before I got to the bottom of the stairs, I called the police watching the doors to see if he'd come. The police arrived 10 minutes later and my parents shortly after. They searched the woods behind my house and the fencing area, and they found some used needles, gloves, and a huge carpet roll, and about 10 cigarettes in the same place. They suggested he must have been watching me in the dark because it would have a perfect view of my room. And what's worst, they never found him. So this is something that I've kept to myself for over 2 years now, and every time I think about it, all the hairs on my body stand up. Here's something that my girlfriend and I really like to try and forget about. So my girlfriend and I really enjoyed trying to find new hikes in western Colorado. We decided to try a new trail that was not on the national monument, and was far away from any other trail. Was a good deal with the way out of town as well. Anyway, we're on one of the only car parks on the trailhead, and as soon as we're walking it gets really dark. Well, we make it all the way until the moon rose, and I stop to hug my girlfriend. Now all of a sudden, further down the road, at least a few miles away, we hear automatic gunfire. It pops, then goes silent, then pops again. Now this kind of thing isn't normal in my area. Now my girlfriend said to me if she thought they were gunshots, and I say I don't think they are. Now we're in the middle of the wilderness at this point. We decided it'd be best to turn back about 2 miles down the trail. Now by this moment we're on top of a very large hill covered in desert shrubs. As soon as we stop talking, we realise something's wrong. All of the insects had stopped chirping, and the crickets had stopped entirely. All of the sounds of nature were gone. My girlfriend was facing further down the trail, and I was facing back the way we come from. She looked behind me and screams. She then starts running. I was already scared, but I figured the worst it could be is some drunk idiot. I turned and looked, and I immediately ran after her. I never ran so fast in my life. The shrubs are about 2 or 3 feet high in varying spots, and when I turned around, I don't know how to describe it, it looks more like a shadow. Even with the moonlight directly shining on it, it's almost absence of any light. Now it's already starting to stand up when I turn around. As soon as it fully rose up, I realised that I was looking up at this thing, and it had to be at least a foot taller than me. It had very clear skin, and bones that don't appear to be human. We sprinted back to my car, still with the whole trail being silent. I was in such a hurry when we ran to the car that neither of us realised that I hadn't taken out my keys to open the car. We're halfway through the drive when we realised that. Now every single hair on my body was raised, and even if I'm being honest, I've never felt anything like it. Every fibre of my body told me to get out of there, and I was almost paralysed by fear that washed over me. Does anyone know what this could have been?